of AMAASE, Ask Me Anything About Social Enterprise. And this is your opportunity to ask those burning social enterprise questions that are keeping you up at night. My name is Leah Bordelin, and I spend my days as the Associate Director of Programming for a number of the centers at the Haskayne School of Business, one of which is the Trico Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Center. And today I am excited to be your host. In fact, today is the first time that I am hosting, so I'm equally excited about that. You can see that we are recording this session. This is for those who are unable to attend, those folks who are possibly out stampeding, as we were talking about earlier, or if you want to be able to have access and rewatch the discussion at a later time. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary is situated on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and this includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I saw someone said once that they believe that a treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. And I really love this way of thinking about it, and because it is an inheritance, and we're all treaty people. And this is something that I take really seriously. If you're joining us from outside of Calgary, maybe you're on holidays somewhere, enjoying your summer, please, feel free to acknowledge the traditional territories where you are in the chat. All right, and we have quite a small crew today, so hopefully we can have a little fun, keep it a bit intimate, and share and have a good conversation. These sessions are designed with you, the audience, as the driver of the discussion. So this is your time to pose your questions. That's what we're all here for. And I will let you start thinking about those questions while I briefly introduce the folks on our panel. First, I'll just go by who I see in my Zoom screen. I'd like to welcome Dan Overall from the Trico Foundation. Thanks for joining. We have Brittany Kerluke, also from Trico Foundation. We have Jane Bisbee from the Social Enterprise Fund. And we have Meredith Parrish from Innovate Calgary joining us today. So welcome to you all for joining us. So now I'd like to invite you to share questions. You're welcome to unmute. You can raise your virtual hand. You can type your question in the chat. We'd love it if you would turn on your video if you're comfortable and able. And please, this is an Ask Me Anything, so it's truly anything. Please don't worry about if your question is good enough or if it counts. You're all welcome here. And if you are wondering about the answer to a question, I would expect that there's someone else in the room wondering about the same thing. Does anyone want to get us started?
Hello, everybody. So my question is I'm just trying to get a better understanding of social enterprises and how I can better support them in my role, because I'm pretty new to my role. So I just want to understand a little bit more of the challenges that social enterprises are facing today. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us?
What's your role?
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about your role?
Yeah, so my role, I actually just started with Innovate Calgary as a coordinator of inclusive innovation. Thank you so much. So I'll be working closely with diverse founders, just helping them get resources, support, and just direct them in the right direction so that they can be successful on their journey.
So I think there's a lot of things, so I'll just focus on a few that sort of seeing is one of the things I talk to organizations a lot is around their team and how do they sort of integrate it within their team. So sometimes boards, as social enterprise becomes sort of a more well-known term, a lot of times boards might be like, we're going to make a ton of money. And often having those conversations with boards around this is starting a small business, and there's a lot of resources that go into that, and things like those are important. Somebody that we probably all worked with on the panel, Jill Andrews, we used to talk about it in terms of, you see those couples who are really struggling in their marriage and they decide to have a baby to solve it. Is sometimes like if organizations are having some challenges that might not be the right time for a social enterprise and might not have the impact. So one of the things like we work with organizations a lot is how to have those conversations with stakeholders, but then also really understanding what their goals are and what they could do with the social enterprise, and maybe some of the pressure points that exist within their models. And in terms of bringing together entrepreneurial and social pieces together is really important. The other one is organizations that are looking for maybe some advice or some guidance. So we talk to organizations a lot about like friendly wise skeptics, but people who have maybe industry experience and are able to kind of push them on some of their assumptions. And so we work with a lot of organizations around that piece too, is oftentimes organizations might be going into an industry they're not familiar with, and that can be really scary. So talking to them about how do you use maybe some camaraderie and work with sort of friendly wise skeptics and people, while also understanding where that advice is coming from. So I think oftentimes there's a lot that can kind of be like, oh, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, but then also like helping organizations pull back and filter through the information that they're getting about what makes sense for their goals and their journey. So sort of that planning piece, we work with a lot of organizations around. I wrote something else, but I can't read my own writing, so I'm going to leave it there, but feel free to add.
I'm going to take maybe a slightly less practical approach. Thank God Brittany's put the practical stuff on the table. I think part of the discussion that needs to happen and what needs to be understood, well, in part that social enterprise or social entrepreneurship is not a silver bullet for something. And it's a matter of really truly understanding what social entrepreneurship means and what it means in both in any kind of corporate structure. So do they really truly understand and have a 360 understanding about what delivering a social mission means? It's just not about the outcome and how you deal with your stakeholders. It's around how you work inside your company. So I'm hoping that both nonprofit and for-profit companies can all kind of be brought to the same place. Corporate structures to understand that they have a responsibility in community. And so how does that change how they operate? And for the nonprofit sector, how do they use business skills and being a social entrepreneur to actually improve what they're doing? So anything you can do to help people truly understand where they stand in the spectrum and what additional skills they need. We tend to not our society and our economy, we tend to not assume that the not-for-profit part of the economy isn't part of the economy. You know what I mean? That they're somehow secondary and they don't deserve access or understanding of the same skill set. So if you can help people understand that, and if you can teach them all either to be more socially responsible and part of their community, and or use business tools better, then you'll be helping them overall. And we could spend days talking about what does that actually mean on a practical level. But I'm out after an economy that doesn't have those two divides, the great divides between the two sides. And to me, that's what the joy of social entrepreneurship as a skill set is about, to try to get to that larger, more practical, more sustainable economy for everybody. So.
I really like where Jane's heading with her answer, but just to share with you, I recently had a conversation with Calgary Foundation, who was speaking to some not-for-profits who were thinking about developing social entrepreneurship. And they said the challenges seem to revolve around three basic buckets. One is just understanding the nature of social entrepreneurship. Number two is the legalities of it, which come up all the time. And you're probably going to see some questions today about legalities. And that includes, do we violate CRA or any parameters by having social entrepreneurship? And the third one is, once we've decided, how do we get started and what are the processes? And that's more the kind of traditional, how do you actually experiment and learn your way into things before funds run out? So they kind of reflect to me what I hear are the three basic buckets. Now, those are very basic, and each one of those have additional issues, but I think they're a pretty good guide. And what's interesting for you as like a support service or being employed by someone who is, just like Trico Foundation, I'm finding one of the key challenges is there's more and more services kind of coming up out of the woodwork, but no one has cracked the code on evaluating whether those services are effective. So challenge one is you're going to want to know all the kind of services that are out there, and NAMATA, which I'm sure the great people we have working with us will put that in the chat. And it's a great start at listing all those, but to have a deeper conversations in the ecosystem of how we actually figure out evaluating whether these services are effective or not is really, really crucial. And it's still anecdotal, but we've heard so many horror stories of people who've gone through services and they're saying, either I learned nothing, it didn't help me, or they're all the same. So I see this as there's two great conversations before us as a social entrepreneurship movement. The one is the one that Jane nailed in terms of the bigger conversation about the power of business models to serve social needs. And I think the second great one, if we're going to live up to the first one, is figuring out how to effectively measure whether all these services are actually empowering social entrepreneurs on their journey.
I'm going to jump back in because I realized what my notes said, and it ties in, I think, nicely with what Dan said. The other thing is, as we have like more programs and we see more examples of social entrepreneurship, oftentimes the focus is on like really traditional approaches to social entrepreneurship. So I'm going to do a buy one, give one model, or I'm going to do donate a percentage. And some people would argue that is social entrepreneurship. Some people would argue that isn't social entrepreneurship. But what I would just say is I think another big challenge is kind of introducing organizations to just how interesting this space could be and how creative you can get into this space. And so even as we talk about other support programs, as well as how do we start integrating those really unique and creative ways that people are harnessing the power of business models for social impact.
Do you have any clarifying questions or follow-up questions from what you've heard?
I guess the thing that comes to me is when would an entrepreneur be like, okay, I want to go and start a not-for-profit, or I want to start a social enterprise? What would kind of be, is there like things that can tell which one's a better option?
Okay, I will give Brittany's common disclaimer. None of us are lawyers, but in Alberta, and in fact, in Canada, there is no such legal entity as a social enterprise. Okay. Any corporate structure can be a social enterprise in how it delivers. I've stopped thinking about social enterprise as a noun, and I think about it as a verb. So the whole discussion about then what is the correct corporate structure is a much longer one and has to be a deep dive into the specific organization. And that's where then the legal stuff comes up and all the rest of it. Sorry, Dan, I'll let you.
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah, it's very much, it's almost like there's two conversations. As one, what is the social enterprise you want to do? What's the model? And then is it a not-for-profit structure or for-profit structure going to benefit you, which again, is, as Jane says, a deeper conversation. What I'd encourage you and others, we find sometimes there's this weird bias and presumption when it comes to not-for-profit and for-profit. So when we used to do a social enterprise award, and for the first time, second year that we did it, we opened it up to both not-for-profit and for-profit. And I think most people would think for-profit is going to make a lot more money than the not-for-profit, right? As it happens, the for-profit that won is barely able to survive and grow past hiring 8 people, whereas the not-for-profit has hired hundreds and is closing in on $20 million in revenue. So it's part of the challenge that Jane talked about of having these conversations is removing that kind of bias. And then just like, again, zoning in on the specific social enterprise model, and then figuring out what legal model would then support that.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. All right. Is there anyone else who would like to pose a question? Rita, welcome.
Hello, so I'm very new to this. I started up my own small business in the last year. And speaking with a couple people, they kind of pointed out that the model I'm working towards sounds similar to what would be considered a social enterprise. So literally I've just been like looking into it. Like very recently, I was sent your group and just told to kind of register and hop on if I could. So I guess I'm just wondering, kind of, as somebody starting out, trying to set up so it'd be a for-profit business, but trying to set it up in a way that does benefit and be like seen as a social enterprise. I guess like resources, advice, anything really that could be taken and used for the future, I guess.
Tell
Kinda
us
what-
about your business.
So it's called Family Time Concierge. Sorry, it's on an iPad, so the video is awful. It's called Family Time Concierge. So what we do is we go in and we help in homes. Typically, both parents are working, and they're just overrun, overworked, exhausted. There's a lot of that mental load that they're carrying. And we come in and we take care of it. So we help with laundry, we help with errands, we help with organizing, meal prepping, meal planning, all of those things that just kind of catch up. And I'm starting the hiring process now, and who I'm looking to hire are typically women, but obviously it's open to anybody who has a gap in their resume. So it's somebody who's had a gap in their resume because they've been at home taking care of their families. And unfortunately, society doesn't view that work as transferable to the workplace, when I think it's probably they're the most hardworking people you'll ever meet. So those are the women I'm looking for. Those are the people I'm looking to hire. And I want to give them meaningful employment where they're offered or they're given sustainable wages. They're given eventually, like I have big plans for the future where I want to give them benefits, and I want to make it so that they can go to work and be proud of the work they're doing, but they can still make it to their kids' practice or game or that award that they don't want to miss, kind of thing. So I want to work it in a way that women aren't being pushed to the side. They are given a chance to work and be proud of everything that they're doing, I guess.
Rita, do you know Hope Cleaning in Calgary? Okay. Ida, can you throw that in the chat box, Hope Cleaning, for me, the link? My colleague is on, and she's so great with links. But one of the things, I talked about this in the previous answer, but one of the things that Trico is a really big proponent for is talking to people who have been there, done that, right? People who have gone through and maybe built a similar type business, maybe not the exact same one, but a similar type business that maybe you could learn from. And Hope Cleaning might be a really interesting organization for you to talk with. I think I want to say Rachel, Meredith, they used to come up quite a bit in Momentum. So set this up, and they actually work with women who have barriers to employment, and doing cleaning services, I think both commercial and maybe home. But we talk a lot about, taking some of our coffee and sort of seeing how they have structured themselves, how they have kind of made those things work, because they're going to identify maybe some pressure points and also some signs of momentum that you haven't considered because they've been there, done that, right? And so that piece of, we talk about them as friendly wise skeptics, but somebody who will help you kind of figure out and give you some ideas of some challenges they had so that you maybe can go past those challenges, is a huge piece that we talk to organizations a lot about, is that piece of camaraderie. So Hope Cleaning is the one that came to mind for me. Some other people here might have some ideas, but I did just think about that one in terms of sort of the mission and also structure, things like that.
Yeah, I would agree. That's a great page. You're at the point where you need to find your tribe. As strange as that may sound, you need to find the other people, because you are describing what I'm hearing is something that I find really important around social entrepreneurship, is that you take more responsibility for the bigger role you have in community. So your responsibility isn't just to shareholders in your company about making a profit. It's about how you are in community. So the fact that you're talking about, you're concerned about the kind of people you're going to employ to give them a leg up, as well as the service that you're trying to provide. It's around that bigger role in community. So I would say, yeah, the Alberta Seed support, the peer group, you may want to sit in on one of those and see whether those kind of people are talking the same language that you're talking. Take a look at some of the things that Trico has to do some analysis around your operation. I would also, you might want to, just to see if it resonates with you, I'd look at the B Corp site, the Benefits Corporation site, and just to see, is that something that speaks to you about how you're thinking about how your business is going to react. The last thing is that at the end of August, there's going to be something called the Social Venture Institute Alberta, which is a gathering of social entrepreneurs in the province, going to be up at Métis Crossing. So if you put SVI Alberta into the Google, it'll probably spit it out. So I think it's an exploration now for you to see whether some of the way that these other entrepreneurs are talking is going to be helpful to you, because it sounds to me like you are heading down that road, whether you knew it or not. We have clients who have even said to me, no, we're not social enterprises, but actually I think they are. They just aren't using that language. And it's not absolute that you use the language, but it's sometimes helpful to meet those other people. And as Brittany says, to take a look at who else is doing it and just connect with them somehow.
That's super helpful. Thank you. I was just gonna, sorry, Meredith, just quickly, I was just gonna say a lot of the people I have spoken with, they don't have the same kind of frame going into it, where it is it's for profit for them, and that's about it, where it's like, I'll contract them out, I'll do this, I'll do that. Don't have them working Mondays because then you have to pay them holidays on Mondays, things like that, where I'm just like, it's just not. So these resources are really great. And I just haven't known kind of which direction to go in to find like-minded people to like build that momentum and go forward.
You found us.
I'll maybe just throw a few more resources in there. The others that come to mind for me, one would be Be Local. You're in Calgary, is that right? Yeah, so I would connect with Be Local too. I think, there's all sorts of different entry points into social entrepreneurship. And I think Be Local has kind of like a good concentration of, folks who have sort of started with a small business lens and are looking to like operationalize some social impact within their model. And so I would definitely check out Be Local. And then the other one, is just the Living Wage Network of Alberta, who may have some resources for you in terms of compensating your employees. So I'll just put a couple of links in the chat there for you as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Meredith. And Rita, it does seem like you've started to find, you're beginning to find your tribe here. So welcome, the second Wednesday of every month. As you move on, keep coming back and sharing and asking questions and sharing your successes as well. That would be great. All right. Are there any other burning questions that anyone here would like to ask?
Do we have any of the people who sent in written questions on the line? Do any of the names line up?
I do indeed see one. So one of the questions is that, are grants available for hiring a BI specialist to develop a social enterprise?
So whose question is that? And maybe we can get a little more clarification they're looking for.
Tatiana.
Hi. Yeah, so we are a nonprofit organization. I work for Jewish Family Services in Edmonton, and we have our home care services that we develop into social enterprise. And despite being in this business for a couple of years at least, we see that the business skills is the major gap for our staff. We are all either social workers or community workers, etc. So we're really trying to bring in business development, business analysis, business intelligence specialists on board, but they cost money. So I'm just wondering if there is any way to access this kind of knowledge either via grants or maybe via some other resources.
Your organization is a charitable organization, right? Yeah. So Dan, Brittany, any suggestions?
So there are like some like government staffing kind of ideas. Our grants, so we have experimentation grants. So it's not necessarily to hire a consultant. Sometimes that can be involved, but it's not necessarily to hire a consultant to come in and do the work. But we do a lot of work with organizations that are really looking at kind of understanding social entrepreneurship and then looking at what do they need to test and learn within that social enterprise. So some business development pieces might be part of that. Like maybe they need to try a marketing plan or they need to try a pilot, something like that. So we have grants for those types of experiments. So for organizations who have kind of identified what's our next step, and this is what we need funding for. And then we do have some programming that is really designed to help organizations start kind of maximizing their potential. So we talk about it in terms of helping organizations understand social entrepreneurship, identifying some of those pressure points. So like with Rita was talking about, hey, I want to hire a certain population, is with that, there's going to be some pressure points built into working with that population. So how do you become aware of sort of your model and how you're bringing the social entrepreneurial together? And then also later on, the materials dive into things like, what are our goals? Where are we headed? We talk about it as a mountain. So like, what is our summit? What are we working towards? What do we need to make that happen? So where do we focus our time first? What are sort of those steps that are going to get us there? And then how testing and maybe piloting and staying in an affordable loss zone are all going to help you move your idea forward. So we have some training for organizations as well available, and it's all available online 24/7. And then, like I said, then we have sort of grants for the organizations that say, this is the next step we need to do. They're not necessarily, like I said, designed to bring like a consultant in to do the work. But also what we've developed is we've developed a quick idea submission form that should take you like under 10 minutes, where you kind of outline what your project is and what you're looking for. So I always tell organizations it's worth just spending that 10 minutes because it does go to our funding committee, and certain things might resonate and other things might not resonate. So I would just highlight that for you on my end. But I can't think of anybody else who's, oh, you know what? The other one is IntegralOrg. So there is an organization called IntegralOrg who use a model where you can actually hire a coach to work with you. And it's usually sort of somebody who has business development experience. And they have grants, sort of, there are social enterprise grants, and there's other types of grants that they do. Edith, can you throw IntegralOrg in the chat box for me? But that's another one that kind of might have sort of that bringing in a consultant to do the work.
I mean, we've had to be open and transparent. Jewish Family Services has been an investee of SEF. They did have a lot there, and you have a lot of background in the route that you want to take. And so this might be a case. So we're going to maybe do a little conversation right here about how to support this, because truthfully, I think you're really far down the road in that you have a lot of research. You maybe don't need business consultant as much as you need somebody to help internally guide you to understand the data you've already got in your hands about about the business you're going to expand. And so, I mean, and this is a really an interesting question that Dan and I have talked about a lot, about how do we get organizations to their next place to understand without, and I will confess, with all, oh, now of course my phone's ringing, with all due respect to all of the consultants in the room who do business planning, I find the best plans come out of the people who are in the business themselves. I tend to sort of look sideways at some plans that somebody else has written for you, because that's somebody else's plan, not yours. So how do we get past that? And I can understand wanting the support and the help. So how do we do that? So Dan, I'm going to shut up now, because I think this may be something we should look into a little further.
I just really ironically want to build on Jane's point in that historically Trico Foundation actually used to fund primarily consultants. And we found, at least in my opinion, most of them didn't work for exactly what Jane is saying. Plus, the reality is if you want to do social entrepreneurship, you're going to need to be a business person, right? So you can't kind of like just have someone come and do a report and then move away. And what we're also finding a lot of times with these consultant reports, they're these big grandiose ideas, and you need the skills to figure out how to kind of take them in piecemeal process and figure them out. So at Trico, we really lean more, rather than hiring a consultant who kind of comes in, leaves something, is actually training you to better understand social enterprise and possibilities, but then also this kind of journey of experimentation and figuring things out within the budget and things like that. So I do actually love Jane's idea of, maybe you're the kind of test case where Trico can work with a social enterprise fund. So with your permission, Titania, maybe Jane and I can have a conversation and then follow up with you and see if you might be a perfect candidate. And then we'll loop Brittany into the conversation. Brittany actually is the one who kind of leads the actual application of the training and processes. So just alone based on what Jane has said, sounds like you might be an ideal candidate if that's something you're comfortable with. And you don't have to
Sounds good. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
And what
Thank you for
you'll
offering.
find as you go through the process with the Trico Foundation, we're very big believers in owning your journey. So all of this has got to be making sure it actually addresses your needs and something you're excited about and suits your purposes. So at all points in the process of this conversation, make sure that it's actually addressing what you want and what works for you, not for us. So please keep that in mind as we begin on this journey.
Well, isn't this like a billion times better than the Stampede? Truly. What a lovely thing to have made this connection here today. Is there anyone else who has a question?
I have a question. This is Sam. Thank you for letting me listen in. I regularly do. People probably wonder what's going on in his head. He's not asking questions, but I have been listening. And I know Jane and I have talked a while back, and I did raise a question earlier about social capital, in that I have worked in the not-for-profit area for over 40 years. So one of my questions after listening is to identify a bit more about this not being a noun and being a verb, and also trying to say something is or something isn't social enterprise. And so it kind of leads me to wonder what is being done that you consider to be social enterprise, and maybe something that isn't social enterprise that people think is social enterprise. In other words, where do you divide between something that is and something that isn't social enterprise? So that would be my question.
Well, since I did the verb not a noun thing, I'll talk about that just briefly. To me, it's when I started, I very much thought it was a thing. Social enterprise was a thing, and you could define it, and then found out that there are as many definitions as there seems to be people who kind of work around this stuff. And more over time, what I became completely entranced by was how this set of tools could actually make all of the economy more equitable. And that if you could teach nonprofits all the secret handshakes that they teach up at MBA school, and that if you could actually convince for-profit businesses to be more conscious and more present and 360-degree in their presence in community and their responsibility to community and all parts of their business. So their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, but their stakeholders, their employees, their supply chain, their place in community, place in the environment, kind of drives everybody to the center. People used to say social enterprise, and there'd be a spectrum, you know, from for-profit companies at one end to not-for-profit charitable organizations at the other. And to me, it's how do we force everybody to the middle so that we actually treat anyone running a business in community, and I think not-for-profits are running businesses too, that they all have a responsibility to embrace a 360 responsibility to their role in community. So to me, that's really what the whole process is all about. Anyway.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I think this is a common question and discussion that comes up, but it always leads to the question for me of like, when are these concrete definitions helpful? And, you know, what do we use them for? And, you know, when are they maybe, you know, unnecessarily categorical? So is it necessary for us to do this work well to say you're a social enterprise and you're not a social enterprise? Or is it actually more helpful for us to, you know, meet people where they're at along their journey and help everyone understand, you know, how they can create more social impact or use business models more effectively?
Yeah, I think both Meredith and Jane's points are absolutely wonderful. And so like definition has its place. And in fact, in our materials, we have definition of a car. I bet you technically don't know the definition of a car, but you've probably either been using or been part of car transportation quite a bit, right? So yes, definition has its place, but to Trico, the more exciting part is not what it is or even the fact that it's a verb, but how far we want to go with it and where we want to take it. To build on Jane's point, it's not just can we be more equitable in our business models, but what would it look like if our business models were as equitable as possible? And I forget whether I gave Ida the link for today, but there was an article today about Hewlett-Packard. Now, I suspect Hewlett-Packard is not a social enterprise. I'm pretty sure it doesn't define itself as a social enterprise. But the things it's doing and trying to push the envelope of how businesses can serve community is phenomenal. There's things like they have a goal that, you know, I think by 2030, they're going to have like all the paper they're using is regenerative and supplies. They're now pushing the envelope of how they can actually get tech to populations that are typically excluded. Like to me, you know, whether you're defining Hewlett-Packard as a social enterprise or not, but these conversations of how to have a company that's more regenerative in the materials it uses, how it pushes the envelope of reaching the marginalized when it comes to tech and things like that. These are the conversations that we should be having about the power of business models to serve society, right? So yes, let's do definition. By the way, technically Trico defines social enterprise as using business models to serve social needs. But the more exciting conversation is how can we fully harness the power of business models to serve social needs to the degree that we need?
I'll just add on to what Dan was saying, but like one of the things is I think building an inclusive space where there is different ways that you can have social impact, and maybe one way is different than the other, but that doesn't mean that you're not having a great social impact. And oftentimes the way that an organization has chosen to have social impact, other people might be like, oh, that's not social enterprise, but it's what's feasible for that organization, and it might be what's feasible for that social issue as well. So there's a lot of decisions to be made as both somebody who's starting up a social enterprise, but also as a consumer and sort of the organizations that you support. And there's that piece around being aspirational. So we had talked about kind of like traditional models, is how can we bring more examples of how creative you can be in this space? And the other thing is, you can evolve and change over time. So if an organization has a model that maybe doesn't get you excited, that doesn't mean they won't 5 years from now. That doesn't mean they won't be doing something really cool because that's what's feasible for their organization 5 years from now, or they've been learning along that 5 years about how to have the best impact or the most impact that they can have. And so often for organizations is making those decisions of, you know, where do we want to be, but also where are we now and what's feasible for us now? And that doesn't mean that's where we're going to stay for the rest of that time. And maybe it is, right? Like what makes sense for us. But I think a lot of the time is when you get stuck in the definition, you lose that ability to be flexible, and you lose that ability to evolve. And I think how we see social entrepreneurship in general is evolving as we see more examples of people getting to the space and being really creative.
Yeah, if I might just add, I appreciate all those comments, and I think that is what I'm hearing you say. So again, you're true to that. It seems to me what I've heard today was a little more about the outcome being social impact. And social enterprise might be the means by which you make a good social impact, and that there are characteristics of being a social entrepreneur that help you bring you down that road closer to having not only being a better social entrepreneur, but having a bigger social impact. So that's kind of what I got from today's discussion. And I think I'm not so much on definition as much as I'm not so big on ambiguity. And so therefore, I find if someone's seeking assistance for clarity, after listening, I'm trying to wonder, what is it that people do in your minds in concrete sense, whether they're one organization type or another, that actually meets those attributes of social entrepreneurship, and maybe more focus should be on how big the social impact is. So that's just my comments. So, but thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? I see that someone else that's here today, Thomas, has asked. Oh, Lloyd, you go ahead. Yeah, you go ahead.
Why don't I, Thomas and I are actually from the same organization, Diversities, and I think Thomas has more understanding of what we're looking at for, and so maybe I'll defer to him, ask him, and if there's anything I can add, then I will.
I know that Thomas has been kind of in and out of the meeting and might be having some trouble with internet. So Lloyd, why don't you get started?
Sure. Okay, so we're from Diversities. We're a charitable organization. And I think it's probably through contacts in Trico that we're participating today. We're just now beginning to consider becoming involved in social entrepreneurship. And one of the concerns is fairly major among the board of directors, which I'm a member of, is that we don't want to jeopardize our charitable status. And so Dan had mentioned the legalities of this, and it is something that we're wanting to be cautious about. We did look at some of the CRA regulations. They seem to be very much, I suppose, open to interpretation. And so for us, we're a little bit, I think, concerned about how we approach this. Though I don't think the actual mechanics of what we intend to do. We're looking at printing, and we have an in-house service that we utilize ourselves, possibly expanding it to other organizations. And then I believe that we would, and Thomas maybe would help me here, is to take whatever profit we have and then turn it back into the organization, into the charitable activities that we conduct, we do. So I guess it's I guess in terms of, you can give us anything in heads up in terms of what we might want to be careful about in terms of jeopardizing our charitable status. That would be helpful, I think.
Now, Leah, do you know, we had Christina was going to attend. I don't know if she made it today. Did you notice whether Christina is here today?
She isn't.
Oh, she isn't? Okay. So it is a complicated issue, Lloyd, and as we mentioned a couple times, we're not lawyers, so we can't provide legal advice. But as Faye would have it, there's this report by the Chartered Accountants of Canada called 20 Questions Directors of Not-for-Profit Organizations Should Ask About Social Enterprise, which is like a really good resource. Have you come across that in your journeys? And if you haven't, and for those who haven't, we can actually put it in the chat and you could get that. And then we have been in contact with Christina, I believe it is, from Miller Thompson. So we can actually relay your questions to her if you want, if Leah agrees. And then finally, Ida, I don't know if you have it, but IntegralOrg has also provided some resources on explain the legalities. I don't know, Lloyd, if you've seen those, but we can put those in the chat as well. Those are a really good start. And I think what you're picking up from CRA is, I think, the reality. I think deliberately they do things where you're going to have to do some interpretation. That's why, even though you do your due diligence, I think the conversation with actually a lawyer is going to be so crucial to help you actually navigate those, those gray areas of these legal issues.
I'll just say two things to this. One is we've financed many charitable organizations to improve their performance as social entrepreneurs. And nobody's had I've been around in this job for 12 years, and so far nobody's had their charitable status revoked because they've worked as a social enterprise. So there are rules you have to follow. You have to have an understanding, but there are ways to do this. The second thing I'll say is that keep an eye open on future developments. One of my, for my sins in a previous life, I've gotten myself onto an advisory committee to the federal government who are encouraging organizations to become social enterprise and to use social finance, become social entrepreneurs. If they're going to do that, they're going to have more clarity around the rules around charitable status if you are a social enterprise. So we are pushing that discussion as one of the priorities of the Social Innovation Council to try to get the departments to talk to each other, because they can't be encouraging you to be social entrepreneurs and to use social finance on one hand and then ding you for it on the other through a different department. So if it's any encouragement, we're trying to get some of those rules clarified, if nothing else. I think Dan's right in that there's a certain amount of ambiguity. No, that's being mealy-mouthed. There's a lot of ambiguity in what you're allowed to do and not do, and that CRA doesn't always want to kind of make that ambiguity go away. So we're going to try to see whether we can get that done. Doesn't mean that anything's going to happen in the next 10 minutes. We could all be dead by the time they actually do it, but it is at least something that is being discussed at those levels, if that's of any consolation whatsoever.
Lloyd, these were touched on, but this is my general list of the 3 things I sent out to organizations that ask me legal questions. I'm super intrigued, Dan, because I don't know if we've ever talked about the 20 questions, and I've been using that for like 10 years. I don't know if we've ever talked about that, and if you came onto it by yourself, but these are sort of the resources I usually do. And when I talk to organizations about that, it's complicated, right? Like there's rules if you're a charitable organization around having a related business Or do you have a separate spin-off that's a for-profit? There's different ways that organizations can structure themselves. And so one of the things I talk to organizations a lot about is that knowing what your goals are and what you want it to look like, because then you can determine the best form that makes sense. So form should follow function. What do we want to do with this? And then what's the form? And the way that I use these tools that I listed here with organizations is I usually give it to them and say, these are some good things to help you kind of figure out what questions you have, because then you can take them to, hey, let's talk about it at the board level. What are we comfortable with? What do we think we're doing with this? The next thing is then talking to an accountant and talking to a lawyer maybe around what's the best structure that makes sense based on the goals that we want to have. But I think the key there is talking about what are the goals that we want to have, and then determining the structure that makes sense for you and makes sense within what is allowable with your current structure.
Okay, thank you.
If anybody wants an anecdote at this point while you're gathering your thoughts, we had a client once that the board decided they were nervous about the social, about whether or not they were compliant with their CRA regulations. So they invited CRA, and they were a really big social, they were doing lots of social enterprise. They had several businesses they were running. They actually invited CRA to come in and audit them about whether or not they were compliant. And CRA came and audited them and said, yep, no problem. And they were running 3 different social enterprises with over $1 million in revenue a year. So from the social enterprises. So it is possible to work within the confines and be compliant. You just need to understand and do all the good research that Dan and Brittany were talking about.
That's a really fantastic point. And rather than kind of doing it and then being audited, CRA actually does have a process where if you're thinking about doing this, you can consult with them first. So you may want to do that. If you Google CRA, there's this thing eventually. I don't have it handy, and I don't think Ida does either, but if you look for it and can't find it, contact us at Trico Foundation, and I'll get you the link of who you can contact from CRA, who will give you an opinion as to whether they think you'd be off bounds or in bounds.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Loy, and thank you very much for answering the question. This is Carmen. I'm sorry I was late and running in and out of the signal is not very good. The idea is that, but thank you. That's answer our questions, and I will look forward to a further discussion with you guys. Thank you.
All right, great. Glad we got you back. I've seen you pop in and out, so I could see something was up there. Any other questions? We did have some questions sent in, but the folks who sent them aren't here. So, and some of them I think require a bit of context, unfortunately.
Maybe they'll be able to join us next time.
Exactly.
Ali, are there any of the questions that you have? Because we do indicate to people that they can send in things. So are there any that you have that we think we could give a shot at?
I've looked at them, and a couple of them were things that we've already talked a little bit about. One question that's interesting is just, it's more of a question of an interest in social purpose impact measurement in data commons and data stewardship governance. An interesting area to discuss, but no real context given there. Is there anyone in the Zoom call that has interest in discussing this or has questions about it?
Well, people are thinking about that. Sorry, Jane, to put you on the spot, but Christine of ABC was looking at some type of data collection with an organization out of Ontario, which is doing some interesting stuff on data commons and things like that. I wish I remember the name of it. I don't. By any chance, do you? Or
is it Common Approaches?
Is it? And they're from Ontario?
I'll Google to confirm and get back to you, but I think perhaps.
Thanks, Meredith.
Yeah, Common Approaches doing some work around this. Measurement is such a thorny question, because measuring what and for who and why is often fraught. In 12 years, I've despaired of coming up with a common approach that will actually work. Because I mean, just look at our portfolio, for example. We have everything from nonprofit housing to 3 lovely Somali refugees who are running a little cafe on 118th Avenue here in town, to environmental plays, to sustainable food plays. There's no way to measure what the impact of what we're doing in a common way that makes any sense. So we end up looking for threads. It really comes down to who's measuring what and what do you want to know at the end of it. Now, it may just be that I'm cynical at this point and no longer have a helpful attitude towards it all. But I find that there are a lot of measurement systems out there, and some of them may work for certain kinds of recipients of that information. But it really comes down to, I think we need to be more specific about the questions we're asking about the impact and why do we want to know. One of the stories that I usually use to illustrate all of this is how many of you have read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? And if I say, okay, so if I say 42, you know what that means, right? They put into the big computer in the sky the question of what's the meaning of the universe, and it thought and thought and thought and spit out an answer, and the answer was 42. Well, so what? How does that help us? So measurement to me is really a matter of who's asking the question, what do they want to know, and how then do we get something that's useful for them? I don't think there's a big answer that can actually be given for every kind of thing. In my shop, it's what I have to measure is what the expectations of our investors are. And are we delivering on those expectations? So that focuses us on how we answer the impact measurement question. And sometimes it's narrative and sometimes it's numbers, but it really depends on I think, who's asking the question and what to them is the important impact that they want to see.
I completely agree with Jane, and I do prefer that approach. And I think actually the data commons should not be finding that one number, but sharing our journeys, learnings, on how each of us actually measures the business model and its impact. But having said that, Ronald Cohen, who's kind of like a godfather of social finance, is trying to do an initiative with Harvard where they can actually develop that kind of one number or that one process of judging like real impact. So just, even though I don't agree with the process, I'm much more agree with Jane's approach. Because the question came up, I shared in the chat his process for trying to find that kind of one unifying process for judging every company's impact for what it's worth.
Great, thank you. It's always nice to have something to, to read and to think about as you contemplate this sort of thing. I guess I will do a last call for questions and leave you with that awkward silence. And as we're closing, I would just also like to provide the opportunity for our panelists to share any updates they have or any closing thoughts that they might have as well before we say goodbye for the day.
I think the stampede is calling.
Don't say that. No, I'm just kidding. The stampede is calling. So a thank you very much to our panel for joining us today. If anyone else here has anything they would like to put in the chat, that's great. You might also want to consider saving this chat because there are lots of great resources in here. Yeah, and lots of great questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is definitely a great time to save that chat. I'm going to do it myself. But have a lovely day, and you will be invited from participating today to join us for the next AMAASE, which will take place on August 9th. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you and have a great evening.